We return to one of the most interesting periods of world history, the Great Migration of Peoples. It's business as usual. Barbarians are creeping out of every crevice, old orders are crumbling, the empire is cracking at the seams, but it's holding on. With incredible efforts, but it's holding on. However, in order for it to hold on, it needs people who are already in short supply to repel attacks from all sides. One such side was traditionally problematic Germany, from where or through which all sorts of crap, from Franks to Huns, was coming. But the Franks are okay. They are still adequate. But the Huns managed to turn everyone against themselves, and no one likes them anyway. But what to do with the forest savages from Jutland, who hold in fear all coastal settlements? Who are the Saxons? Well, the obvious answer is a Germanic tribe, 100% correct. Traditionally, for most Germanic tribes, their problems start as early as their name. The problem is that Saxon is not an ethnonym. It's a knife. A heavy 40-centimeter knife, which was equally handy for slicing up a boar for dinner or an overenthusiastic Roman. But what the Saxons called themselves is not very clear. For the first time, they are mentioned in Ptolemy's geography. Only in the part of copies they are Axons. And these Axons, theoretically, can be mentioned in Tacitus' Avians, who lived somewhere in Jutland. Where exactly the Avians lived is another separate question, because Avianis means inhabitants of islands, and there are many islands there. Yes, everything written above might seem untrue if it weren't for the fact that the historical friends of the Saxons, the Frisians and the Angles, lived nearby. Unfortunately, it still looks implausible, so traditionally we have to be guided by toponyms. And here we are, helped by the province of Westphalia, Westphalians, one of the sub-tribes of the Saxons, and the federal state of Lower Saxony, located just next to the Jutland Peninsula, and coinciding in location with those places where, according to the same Ptolemy, lived the Saxons. And there was a funny thing called the Saxon coast. And no, the Saxons didn't live there. It was just the opposite. You see, the Saxons were the ancient version of the Vikings. That is, they sailed their ships along the coast and robbed coastal settlements. In order to prevent this, the Romans simply paved the shores of the English Channel with forts, most of which later became cities. However, the pirates did not hinder it much. The same base on the Orkney Islands Theodosius the Elder, father of Emperor Theodosius, destroyed only in 371. Well, and yes, they gradually spread across Germany, eventually settling actually in Lower Saxony, between the Rhine, Elbe, the central mountainous region of Germany, and the North Sea coast. They were different from the other tribes, by the way. That is, they were blue-eyed tall blondes, true Aryans, but they had one very interesting feature: democracy. While the tribes around them were ruled by kings, the Saxons were ruled by a ting, a council. In times of war, of course, one chief was chosen to lead the tribe into battle, but in times of peace, this was not necessary. Later, during the Frankish rule, this system even developed into a kind of parliament, when a representative was appointed from each administrative unit. However, when the Franks removed the jiao, the ting also collapsed. But it's all boring, all this politics and ethnology. We need meat. Well, we'll give you meat. The most famous role of the Saxons in world history is their participation in the conquest of Britain, along with the Angles and in part the Frisians. For that, we need a little context. Britain is a province. It is far and wild, and some Saxon pirates will rob it on the way. A telling example is the so-called Great Conspiracy, when the Federates on the borders deceived the Romans into letting a horde of Picts, Scots, and other northern tribes into the interior. And yes, Saxon pirates joined in the fun. As a result, most of Roman Britain was overrun and devastated. The remaining garrisons held on by sheer fortitude, and Rome didn't find out until 6 months later. Yes, Theodosius the Elder returned with reinforcements and recaptured the territories up to Hadrian's Wall, but the province was in a disgusting state. We had no time to exhale. As the Viceroy of Britain, Magnus Maximus, leaves with most of the soldiers stationed on the island and local Gauls to conquer the imperial power. To do this he succeeded, and this power he even enjoyed for some time until he was not overthrown by Theodosius the Great, son of Theodosius the Elder. But the garrison never returned to the islands, and those soldiers who remained there went to the continent, under one banner or another. In 410th year, on the request for help of inhabitants of Britain, Emperor Honorius answers that they can do what they want. Roman rule in Britain ended, and immediately began wars with the advancing from the North Picts and also with neighbors. Letters to Rome continued to be written, but there was no time for that. The population of Europe was trying to stop Attila, and Picts in the north do not sleep. In short, Romano-Brits, instead of writing to Rome or Byzantium, have accepted, at first sight, successful decision. They have decided to invite Germans, the king of the Britons, and the Romans who remained on the island, Vortigern, to fight against the invading Picts, called two barbarian commanders, brothers Horse and Hengist. Of course not for nothing, but for the right to settle on the island of Thanet. And everything seemed to be going relatively well, until Hengist decided that he needed a bigger island, and turned his warriors against the British. Most likely they were not paid, or were paid but little. Gilda the Wise writes that the Saxons almost extorted supplies from the Britons under threat of robbery. Beta the Honorable mentions that before that there was a terrible famine in the country, and only by a miracle the Picts did not throw the Brito-Romans into the English Channel. However, with the arrival of the Saxons, they managed to stop swinging away and started beating the Picts themselves. But in general, the story is about the same. More Jutland tribes came to the call of relatives, which, in the end, decided to take more than they offered. One important thing to note here is that the Saxons were not Christians. The Britons were partly. Neither were most of the mainland tribes. But the word of God did not reach the Jutland Peninsula. As a result, the visitors from across the seas felt absolutely no regret in the process of plundering and killing. Both Gilda and Bede claim that the southern provinces were devastated, and the Jutlanders, having settled on the territory of the island, founded 7 kingdoms. Specifically, the Saxons owned kingdoms with the characteristic names of Sussex, Wessex, and Essex. Of these, Wessex should be especially noted. It is the kings of Wessex will be able to unite the heptarchy in a single kingdom. Here, the kings of Wessex were greatly helped by chance. After the great pagan army of the Danes once again devastated Britain, the ruler of Wessex, Alfred the Great, suddenly found that the northern kingdom of Northumbria no longer existed, and neighboring states lay in ruins. At the same time, his land was virtually untouched compared to the rest of the land. Through the efforts of several generations, England was subjugated to the Saxon lineage, although the original Saxons were no longer there, all mixed together, so the United Kingdom of England appeared. But not for long. The Danes did end the independence of Wessex, and then the Normans came to visit, and we all know what happened next. But that's only part of the Saxon story. A lot of them stayed on the continent. What happened to them? Did they make it to the top? In short, yes. A little longer, no. In detail, yes, but not quite. While some of the Saxons were ravaging Britain, another branch of the tribe was gradually moving westward. Even before that, they had invaded the territory of the Ripuan Franks and drove them out, leaving them with only a narrow strip of land along the coast. After that, they went about their favorite business, killing and pillaging along the Rhine and the coast. The only problem was that there was no one left to plunder in the east, and the Saxon coast still existed and was even a little bit serviced. What to do? The right thing to do was to go on another campaign. So, on the territory of modern France there are 5 conventional states: the kingdoms of Visigoths, Burgundians, and Franks, the land of Alemanni, as well as independent Gaul, led by the former Roman dux Aegidius. Affairs at it went not very. Constantly climbed Alemanni and Burgundy, suspiciously squinted at the free lands of the Goths, and only the Franks were on the side of the Romans. Suddenly, that's right, the Saxons sailed in and immediately seized Armorica, now Brittany. Aegidius was too busy fighting the Visigoths to respond, and as soon as he made peace with the latter, the Saxons struck, capturing the city of Anger. Aegidius died, but there was no full-scale war, sort of. although the Saxons traditionally sailed along the Loire riverbed and plundered the population, taking hostages along the way. But it seemed not enough, and they again attacked Angers and even killed their Comite Paul, the successor of Aegidius. Unfortunately for the Saxons, just the next day the Franks, allies of the Romans, came there, knocked the Saxons out of the city, and then went through the islands on the Loire with fire and sword, slaughtering all who lived there, to zero, although they themselves lost many. It was probably this defeat that pushed most of the Saxons to turn the vector of plundering towards Britain, especially since Hengist already had its own kingdom, and part of them remained to live in Brittany and Normandy, gradually merging with the locals into one big nation of Bretons. An interesting fact is that the leader of the Saxons was a certain Odoacer. Is it the same Odoacer who sometime later will put an end to the torment of the Western Roman Empire? A good question. Historians have not yet found out. As for the rest of the Saxons who lived on the territory of the Rhine, everything ended sadly for them. First, they were conquered by the Franks. After that, they tried to baptize the Saxons. The Saxons, as I said, were pagans and savages. So they literally cut all the preachers and in no way wanted to give in, unlike their British relatives. After a significant number of Saxons were slaughtered during the war, some of the chiefs converted to Christianity. This circumstance did not prevent the Saxons from raising another rebellion the next year, and then Charles once again went through the country with the cross and the sword. In the same year, by the way, the Saxons destroyed the punitive expedition against the Slavs Sorbs, future Serbs, in the Battle of Mount Zuntal. Charles finally lost his temper, and in the city of Verdun executed 4,500 Saxon hostages. But it took another 3 years to finally subdue the Saxons. Finally, another uprising. Charles was not ceremonious here. It ended with him simply slaughtering the Saxons almost completely, repopulating their habitats with his own settlers, and those who for some reason survived settled in the interior of the Frankish kingdom. In principle, somewhere at this stage, the history of the Saxons as a tribe ends. All have either merged with neighbors or ceased to be a tribe and became a nation to again merge with neighbors. So ingloriously ended the history of the Saxons in Europe. Fierce sea raiders, guys with long knives and a broad soul, they will forever remain in our hearts.